For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are at all interested in learning more about us, please feel welcome to grab myself or another staff member at the conclusion of the event, or visit us at iwp.edu. To support the work of IWP, please visit us at iwp.edu/donate. Again, that is iwp.edu/donate. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Enrico Suardi, who will deliver a lecture entitled A Historical Overview of Coercive Persuasion, as part of the Behavioral Sciences in National Security and Law Enforcement lecture series. Dr. Enrico Suardi, who himself is an alumni of IWP and graduated in the class of 2019 with an Executive MA in National Security Affairs, is the Director of Psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Director of Forensic Services at the Ross Center in Washington, D.C., and the 2024-2025 President-elect of the Washington Psychiatric Society. As a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology in Psychiatry, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Forensic Psychiatry, as well as being a member of the faculty at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Georgetown University, and George Washington University, he has served as Chief Child and Family Psychiatrist at the U.S. State Department. Dr. Suardi studied political psychology with Gerald Post, completed his MD and a residency in preventive medicine in Milan, Italy, and obtained a Master's of Science in Public Health and Policy from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. With that, please welcome Dr. Enrico Suardi.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for all your help, Sean. Thank you for being here. Today's talk is part of a series of presentations on the behavioral sciences in national security and public safety. Actually, Dr. Gandhi, my colleague psychiatrist Dr. Gandhi, who sits right here, and I are working on putting together a course for IWP, and we hope to be able to offer it starting in 2024. But today's topic is the psychology of persuasion and coercion. And I'm going to start out with a historical overview of something that different authors have referred to as coercive persuasion, dark persuasion, thought reform, brainwashing, and even menticide, or the rape of the mind. And you can see on the slides books that I've used that I reviewed for this historical overview. In particular, the book of Dr. Dimsdale, who's himself a psychiatrist, Dark Persuasion. We have the next slide, thank you. Well, since long before science became involved in all these, persuasion and coercion have been the realm of philosophy, religion, and politics. There's always been a relatively bright side. You know, preachers have proselytized, philosophers have taught rhetorics, you know, how to use words to convince people. Shamans have used hypnotic suggestion to foster healing. But there's also been a dark side to this because the power players have always used coercion and even torture to enforce their rule. Let me move forward. So we're moving quickly to modern times, and we're going to the Soviet Union, and it's 1924, and we're in Leningrad. And September 1924, the Neva, that is the river of Leningrad, has flooded. And we are in the basement of the Institute of Experimental Medicine. And the dogs that are the subjects of the experiments are kept in cages in this institute. And so they're stuck in their cages and the water is rising. And they're terrified. Eventually, a handler shows up and rescues them, just in time so that they don't drown. But after that day, the dogs would not be the same. Their behavior changes and never goes back to baseline. Now, this is no ordinary laboratory. It's the laboratory of Dr. Ivan Pavlov. Dr. Pavlov is nothing less than a Nobel Prize winner at that point. He won the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1904 for studies on digestion. But Dr. Pavlov is better universally known as the person who discovered classical condition, who described classical conditioning as a way to learn automatically. Now, 5 years before this flood and what it did to these dogs, Lenin went to visit Ivan Pavlov in his laboratory. That's 2 years after Lenin had taken powers. And that was not just a courtesy visit. Lenin had some questions for Pavlov. Wanted to know if his studies could help the communists engineer the new man. And Pavlov told him that under certain circumstances, behavior can be changed in a lasting way, overcoming hereditary factors. Now, 5 years later, Pavlov learned from the experience of these dogs and the flood, and what he derived from that was a theory of traumatic disintegration. Then he went on to test in psychiatric patients that he had access to, thanks to Lenin. And so what he came to realize is that individuals who are severely traumatized can be very suggestible. Now, the communists remained interested in his work. You can see, I think, here the obituary of the Pravda when he died. And they were interested in how he could help them, create a new communist man. Now enter here Stalin and Stalin's purges and the court trials, the show trials, right? And so what observers were impressed with was the way, and we can move to the next slide, thank you, was the way the people put on trials would, instead of trying to defend themselves, would incriminate themselves and seemed to be eager to incriminate themselves and came up with confessions that were, seemed to be obviously false. And so observers, from other countries began to suspect and think that the communists had come up with some new techniques to alter people's mind, to extract confessions, and so forth. But what they were really doing was, using the old techniques of the Czarist police with the insights, with adding the insights that they have from Pavlovian studies about traumatic disintegration under conditions of severe deprivation and the use, meticulous use of reward and punishment. We can move on, thank you, Sean. Well, I'm moving from communist Russia to communist China, and we are now in 1950. And an American journalist, Edward Hunter, who was a propaganda expert in the OSS during the war, is a foreign correspondent at that point in Asia, and is covering the Maoist indoctrination. Is writing about that, and he coins a new term at the time, brainwashing. Brainwashing has become spread and has has taken a life of its own. But it was coined in 1950 by Edward Hunter. who calls brainwashing the intense indoctrination that the Chinese communists have devised. Now, this term comes from the Chinese jinao, which means brain, wash the brain. And the metaphor of jinao has a long history in China. It comes from jijin, which means wash the heart. And that is a concept that is common in the Confucian, Buddhist, Taoist traditions. And it has to do with rectification, with purification of oneself, right? Now, the Chinese communists never refer to their indoctrination process as brainwashing. They call it thought reform. And the Chinese started, creating these systematic thought reform techniques in the 1920s, where there weren't very many of them. It was the revolutionary, phase of their history, and it was key for them to, to convince people that they would capture, right? Soldiers of the Kuomintang and so forth, and to have them join their forces. And so they came up with a system in which they provided unexpected leniency to their captives. And they actually would encourage them to vent their frustrations against their authorities, their past authorities. And there were terms for this. It was a sequence, systematic of actions. And so eventually they would offer the captives the opportunity to join the heart movement after they had vomited bitter water, after they had been digging the bitter roots. Now, the thought reform becomes more sophisticated in subsequent years, and there is a program designed for intellectuals, so more cultured people. And this is part of the ideological effort that results in the consolidation of the Mao Zedong thought as party dogma. And so by the 1940s, we have the definitive form of this thought reform process that has acquired an ideological enthusiasm and a dogmatic quality that are actually not consistent with that Confucian Chinese tradition that, where the sage is actually restrained and quietly wise, right? Here, there is this ideological enthusiasm to which individuals are expected to surrender. But that's what the American POWs will face in the Korean War. It's a well-orchestrated spectrum and sequence of lenient and coercive manipulations, overwhelming pressure that comes from the group, because that's what really the Chinese add, the group pressure in struggle sessions. And the goal here is to have the individual metaphorically die, the old self, so that they can be reborn as a new self, as a communist self, right? And this will result in, false confessions about germ warfare, for example. And, some of these POWs will decide to not return home because, as Edward Hunter put it, they were brainwashed, right? Or because, as the Chinese communists would say, they were reborn as communists and so thought reform. Can we have the next slide? All right, I'm going to go back a little bit here to Europe and to the early 40s. And here we have, again, these show trials, Stalin's show trials, Wyszynski, the chief prosecutor. And the Nazi Germans, see this, and they think that the Soviet Union has found way to, some kind of truth serum, right? And they go about finding their own shortcuts to do coercive persuasion, right? They don't care that much about that long-term psychological trauma disintegration. They want drugs that do the job quickly. And they look at drugs in obstetrics and psychiatry for this purpose, interrogation, right? And also they start experimenting with mescaline, which is a natural occurring hallucinogenic substance. And they do this in a concentration camps among many other atrocious experimentations, as we well know. Some of them will be put on trial in Nuremberg for those actions. Not among them, perhaps the most infamous, Joseph Mengele, who died apparently natural death much later in South America. We move forward. So in the meantime, in the West, in Britain, a psychiatrist, Dr. Horsley, devises a new intervention that he calls narcoanalysis. Narcoanalysis is psychotherapy, psychoanalysis combined with intravenous administration of barbiturates. And the purpose is clinical, is to treat trauma. But already in 1943, the Office of Strategic Services in the United States convenes a panel to study the possibility of using drugs to interrogate prisoners of war. And the group is chaired by no less than the superintendent of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where I work, at the time, Dr. Overholser. Includes academics, includes intelligence personnel, and it goes on to approve the testing of various substances for the purpose of interrogation. Eventually, in 1943 also, there is the discovery by Albert Hoffman of the hallucinogenic properties of LSD. And as LSD will become the drug of choice for this type of experimentation. Now, the context here is that the US is winning the war, the World War II, but it is clear that there will be another global confrontation, and there is another very insidious and totalitarian adversary, the Soviet Union, and so both the U.S. and the Soviet Union have sort of parallel operations to hire. To get the German scientists, some of the German scientists. Now, the majority of these scientists were involved in a rocket program of the Nazi, but some of them were involved in this, let's say, biochemical research of drugs for interrogation. And in 1947, the US government launches a secret program for this purpose again. Initially, it's defensive, but then it acquires an offensive side. It goes through different iterations, different names. Perhaps the best known name is MK Ultra. MK Ultra was nothing but a covert funding program for research and development of chemical, biological, and other materials that could be used in operations to control human behavior. Approved in 1953 by the then Director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles. This program is in existence for about 10 years. And ends up funding over 100 projects, some of which have to do with projects conducted in universities, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, prisons, and some of these includes the administration of psychotropic drugs, mainly LSD, to unwitting subjects in normal life settings. Now, in 1963, the Inspector General of the CIA takes a a close look at this and concludes that this is unethical, this is distasteful, and it has to end, and it ends the next year. To my knowledge, this has been referred to as the Manhattan Project of the Mind, but there were, to my knowledge, no real scientific breakthrough. No truth serum was found, no recruitment deal was devised, right? And instead there were victims, and perhaps the best known case is the case of Dr. Olson, Frank Olson, who was a scientist and who was surreptitiously given LSD in 1953 and died days later by suicide. And so here we have President Ford, and now this comes up, as it always happens, right? So in the 1970s, all this comes up, there is an uproar, and here we have President Ford apologizing officially to the family, who also sued and certainly had their day in court. Actually there was no day in court because there was, they were paid. Can we have the next? It's a very different approach, and arguably, certainly ethical and arguably effective to counter the effect of brainwashing torture is the SEER training. Special evasion, resistance, and escape. It was really born out of the suffering of the prisoners of wars in Korean War. And it was developed by a working group that was established by President Eisenhower. The purpose was to train service members to cope with the stress of captivity. It was implemented fully in 1961. Under the aegis of the U.S. Air Force, has been in existence since, has grown, and psychologists have been involved in running the program as a realistic stress laboratory to enhance performance under severe stress. So, next slide. So, fair to say that between the 1920s and 1960s, governments and government-funded entities, such as universities and others, have tried to develop tools for and against brainwashing for political and military reasons. But, what's been seen, as far as I know, as far as I can tell from the readings, is that again, no great achievements here can be described. No truth serum, no recruitment deal. And of course, group pressure, psychological coercion, psychological torture, deprivation, coupled with this mix of reward and punishment does break down most people. But that doesn't really produce reliable information, because a lot of false confessions are elicited, and also people are left traumatized. So they're essentially of no use for whoever does that. But if the goal is to break down, brainwash, that certainly can happen, and it's nothing new, right? Now, with the 1970s, new players, new actors that are non-state entities enter this dark game of coercive persuasion, including criminal and terrorist groups and cults. And I'm going to have some examples here of that. Starting from the Stockholm Syndrome, I'm sure you've heard and familiar with. And that's not a clinically recognized diagnosis, but there is some literature in some of these in the PTSD literature as a variant. And it originates from what happened in 1973, August 1973 in Stockholm. There was a bank robbery, and the robber didn't just want to rob the bank, wanted to have hostages and then negotiate with the authorities the release from prison of a body of his. So a criminal, essentially, with that kind of a plan. And this becomes an ordeal of 5-6 days. You know, the Prime Minister of Sweden is involved himself in a negotiation. But what happens in those days, and that's surprising, you know, to many, is that the captives, the hostages, become sympathetic towards the captor and distrustful of authorities. And that's not because the captor was trying to brainwash them or convince them. That was not his intention. It was a spontaneous thing that happened in a context of a situation that is so coercive and dangerous and leads to a state of regression to sort of early childhood. So that little children, the adults, to become little children psychologically dependent on these sort of, you know, dysfunctional parent dystopian, in this dystopian situation, you know, they become sympathetic towards them. And that's what the person who actually then went on to develop the FBI hostage crisis negotiation program in the 1970s said about this situation. So that's the Stockholm Syndrome. Can we have the next slide? So a year later, 1974, there's another bank robbery. This time we are in San Francisco, in the U.S. You know, if Stockholm Syndrome is the term, you know, created by the media in 1973, flash conversion becomes popular in 1974. And it's a mix of Stockholm Syndrome and brainwashing. This is the case of Patricia Hearst that you may have heard about. Patricia Hearst, the heiress of a family of media tycoons. At that time, 19, an undergrad student at Berkeley, she's violently kidnapped by a group called Symbionese Liberation Army. This is a revolutionary, small revolutionary group, one of actually a number of these groups that were active in the Bay Area at that time. So their plan is to get a huge ransom and redistribute to the poor. So they want to get a lot of publicity and become the Robin Hood of their time, right? And that's what happens. The family starts paying ransom in form of massive donations of food, you know, in various neighborhoods. This goes on for a couple of months. Meanwhile, they sent out these recordings of Patricia, who initially is terrified, and then, you know, appears to be sort of reading or regurgitating propaganda material that they have given her. But after 2 months, they have enough of this, the SLA, right? They think they have accomplished what they wanted. And so at that point, they decide to not kill the hostage. They tell her, you know, you like the pet chicken, you know, people like you, we don't want to, you know. So you can either leave and go back to whatever you want, or join us and change completely your life. And she joins them. And she changes her name, and that's the bank robbery of 1974 in San Francisco, where she is involved. You know, she makes the FBI wanted list, and in 1975 she's apprehended. After a few weeks in custody, she denounces the whole thing and said, I've been terrified the whole time, I've been brainwashed, right? So the case goes to court. Expert for the defense says this is, you know, quintessential brainwashing. Expert for the prosecution says no, this is a born rebel who found in a dystopian way a cause, right? And she has actually she's found guilty, she's sentenced. A few years later, President Carter lets her free before the end of her sentence, and President Clinton, on the last day of his presidency, pardons her. I have a video, but I don't know how we do it time. Perhaps we can skip this. But what's interesting, and these videos are on online on YouTube. What's interesting is to hear how she changes, in those months, the flash conversion, right? And how she endorses the lifestyle, the position, uses the ideologically charged jargon, and call herself Tanya instead of Patricia. This is her boyfriend, and so forth. But we can move on, I think. All right, so now I want to talk about cults as well, because they're also part of the landscape at this point. 1978, November 1978, Congress has approved a fact-finding mission to sort of go and find out what's going on in the jungles of Guyana, where a group, a congregation led by so-called Reverend Jim Jones, is leading, almost 1,000 people, has created, they are creating a community of their own. But they moved from California to Guyana, and of course, the families are extremely worried. And so Leo Ryan, a congressman, leads this fact-finding mission. They arrive, things go tragically. He's killed, Leo Ryan. Others are killed by the followers of Jim Jones. The chief of staff will survive. She'll become a congresswoman herself later on. But that day, Jim Jones decides to go ahead with a plan that he has had for months. That is the mass suicide, the revolutionary mass suicide of his congregation. Over 900 people drink a mix of Kool-Aid and the cyanide prepared by the doctor of the mission, of the congregation, and die. Men, women, children. It takes hours for this to happen. It's all on tape. And maybe we can hear a little bit some of his last speech and how people reacted. Maybe just a minute.
Violence and violence shall take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. I'm ready to go. If you tell us we have to give our lives now, we're ready. I'm ready to do it. This is a brother with me. I tried to keep this thing from happening.
So this gives you just a taste of this tragedy. He had become increasingly paranoid. He was addicted to a cocktail of drugs, and there's a lot that's been written about this case. You may know that. Well, about 20 years later, another cult, 1997. This is the Heaven's Gate group, led by Marshall Applewhite, who went by the name of Poe. So actually not about 39 members of the group are found in a house found dead in a house in a suburb of San Diego. Now, Poe was a New Age preacher, had preached around the country for years. Eventually had formed this group, so what these people really believe, was that there was another life, an extraterrestrial life, and that if they kill themselves, but they didn't think they were killing themselves, they would be teleported to a space ship and start an eternal life, extraterrestrial. In 1997, there was a comet, particularly luminous comet, Hale-Bopp comet, that was visible, you know, in California. And so there was this theory that behind the comet was hiding this huge spaceship, right? That the appearance of the comet had to do with the arrival of the spaceship. These people believed it entirely. You know, Marshall Applewhite had convinced them, and so they thought they were going for this wonderful eternal life, and they left. This is already internet age. They posted messages. They left a lot of you know, for the public to know that nobody had forced them. They were happy. There was no anger and so forth. You know, but what happens here is that he had given them the instrument as one of these people who did not, you know, go on to commit suicide, said he had given them the persuasive instruments to brainwash themselves, right? There's a video here, but maybe we can skip it in the interest of time. All right, now psychologists have studied persuasion and coercion for decades. There are some seminal studies. I have three videos that I will show in part. We will show in part that are about studies conducted in 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s about social influence. So they're pretty self-explanatory, so maybe we can start this one and maybe I'll add some comments later.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with a white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence. Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. What he found through interviews.
So, you know, it's obvious, you know, what is the answer, right? But the pressure, you know, of conforming to the majority is such that over a third of these subjects, healthy subjects, cave in and conform. Now, interestingly, you know, if only one person at the other five gives the right answer, that percentage goes down from 37% to 5%. So having another person dissenting from, you know, that allows that person to tell like it is, you know, to say what they've really seen. We can move on to the next seminal experience. You know, this was done at Swarthmore in 1950s, series of experiments. Now we have in the 1960s, Stanley Milgram at Yale, and let's see, you know, a few minutes of this. Obedience.
Incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II. How is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people who are courteous and decent in everyday life could act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. I wanted to study was a little different, went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and you see it in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as a teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. It's going to be 195 volts.
The learner is hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this is all a simulation, nothing is really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said...
Because you get it. Now, these are regular people, healthy people. They will give a shock that could be fatal to somebody because, and not because they've been threatened or you know, paid for this. Because somebody with a white coat, as the scientist, tells them this is what needs to be done for the purpose of this experiment. So obedience. The last video I have on this series is come from 1971 study, the Stanford prison experiment. This is a study that was supposed to last 2 weeks, had to be interrupted after 5 days because the conditions became unsafe. Now here, the difference is that everybody knows that this is a simulation. All the subjects know that it's a simulation. And it's done in the basement of the Institute of Psychology at Stanford University. And the subjects that are male students are divided between, you know, guards and prisoners. So they have to act like guards or prisoners. So the first day, it's awkward. Nobody really knows what. By the second day, the prisoners are provocative. The guards react by being coercive, increasingly coercive. By the 5th day, the studies, you know, and the chief, you know, here is Phil Zimbardo, who acts as the warden, but he is kind of hands-off warden. He doesn't tell them what to do. He doesn't tell them where the limits are, right? So maybe we can see a minute of this and then move on.
First day, I said, this is not going to work. The boys felt walk with giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners start giggling. And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoner's named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the
I was certainly fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups.
We can stop here. You get a sense of what happened there, right? So he wanted to push him and see how far he could go, and led the group, right? So next, starting from the 1970s, also a social psychologist, Dr. Cialdini, began studying what he calls ethical persuasion, social influence, ethical persuasion. He went undercover and worked in, as a car salesman, as a marketing person, various jobs. He was really doing his research, but he didn't tell anybody. And so in 1984-5, he published what has become a huge bestseller. And you see that right there, the psychology of persuasion. And he, among other things, has come up with 6 principles of social influence that are studied in this is all studied in business school, marketing, and so forth. And the principles are things like reciprocity. We feel obligated to repay others if we receive something. Scarcity, if we value things that are rare, difficult to obtain. Authority, we are more likely to follow those who appear credible, knowledgeable. Consistency, if we have done something, we tend to do it again, right? So if we have had a commitment, we will continue to have that commitment, maybe donate more next time, right? So, and so forth, right? So the research of Dr. Cialdini is also seminal. Coming to more recent times, I picked one study here, and really this is about showing how if people who are good at persuading others are also good at mentalizing. Mentalizing, the theory of mind, means being attuned to the mental states of others. One's own mental states and the mental states of others. And having the flexibility, cognitive, emotional flexibility to adjust the strategies based on how the mental state of the other person, changes. Move on. Now, neuroscientists, there's also been brain research on persuasion, how the brain works when, persuasion is at work. And here what we find is what is found by researchers is a complex interplay between areas of the brain that are in charge of cognitive and emotional processes. So brain regions that are involved in attention, memory, and emotion processing. So the making of plans, the evaluation, the execution of plans, and then the memory processing, the emotional processing. We can move on. Now, coercion is also studied by neuroscientists. And here I find it interesting that there is some research that suggests that the sense of agency that we experience when we are coerced to do something that goes against our preference, right, and harm others, is reduced. So in other words, we can feel less responsible because our actions are perceived as sort of passive movements rather than volitional things. But there is also research suggesting that actually this emotional distancing from the action that harm others can happen only if we endorse the action, only if we are willing participants, right? And so we can resist coercion. Now, And resistance to coercion is also, is also subject of research. And I picked a study that I find interesting because it identifies, it uses a construct called reactance. Reactance is resistant to coercion. And finds that the underpinnings of reactance are cognitive and emotional. Cognitively, it's the counter-arguing, the coming up with arguments against the arguments of the coercive entity. And emotionally is anger, and anger leads to retaliation. Right? So, counter-arguing and anger as underpinnings of resistance to coercion. We can move on. So we're in the 21st century, and cognitive warfare is ongoing. The battle for the mind, the battle for the brain. A white paper of NATO talks about the brain, the mind, the human mind as the sixth domain of operation. Right? There is land, there is sea, there is air, there is space, there is cyber, and then there is a sixth domain of operation that is the mind. Right? The question is, is it really a new domain of operation, or has always been perhaps the most important domain of operation since when Sun-Tzu wrote about winning without war, a concept that it was echoed by Dr. Orlinczewski in a paper published last year. Right? So, an introduction to cognitive warfare here would require a whole other conversation, but suffice to say that, we're in a digital age, the age of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, of data mining, and we spend so much time online, and so much can be known about us, right? We work, we study, we socialize, and everything can be tracked. And everything, all this data can be mined, right? And so this information, this data can be used for political need, and it is used for political intelligence, military purposes, with the type of this information that can be very, very precise and sophisticated, right? So one aspect of cognitive warfare in the 21st century is really this sophisticated disinformation, how to counter it, right? And how to ethically persuade others using these means. The other is, the other aspect that I think is important here is the evolution of neuroscience and neurotechnology. That quest to find, tools, devices, drugs that can alter people's mind in the way that we want has never ceased to exist. And now neuroscience and neurotechnology offers ways to do this that are certainly more sophisticated. There is a author, a psychologist, ethicist at Georgetown University, Dr. Giordano, who has written extensively about this. And it's important to say that he's also an ethicist, so he's trying to find ethical way to go about this so that we can stay apace, we can stay ahead of our strategic competitors. So you see how China is active in this area, but in an ethical way, right? And so in conclusion, I just want to emphasize this ethical persuasion here, the ability to mentalize, to understand what others think and feel. This goes with the concept of strategic empathy that I mentioned at the end of my last conversation here. And also I want to emphasize that knowing others, but also knowing ourselves, what we stand for, our values, and our passion for freedom, the freedom of the freedom of expression, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear. I want to end on this, freedom for fear. So ethical persuasion, not the coercion that brainwashes, that destroys psychologically others, makes them useless, if you want to use them in the future, and really produces a lot of false information, a lot of false confession. So I'm ending on this note. Thank you so much. There was one other slide, but it's about the work that DARPA, IARPA do on these matters.
And in the interest of time, we can only take one question in our formal Q&A, but if you have questions for Dr. Suardi afterwards, I'm sure you will be happy to answer in the lobby. So do we have any questions?
Yes, my name's Cornelia Weiss. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. And would you tell us what DARPA is doing? I'm quite curious.
Well, can we have the last slide, Sean? So, for example, they're working on research programs related to persuasion, utilizing artificial intelligence, machine learning to analyze how social networks work. To understand how individuals and groups are influenced by messages that they receive on social media and online, and to essentially counter disinformation and improve resilience to influence, right? When I say let's cherish our freedom, that's how we become resilient against disinformation. There are also neuroscience, neurotechnology studies conducted by DARPA and IARPA. It's interesting that there has been something that has a very long name, National Research Council's Ad Hoc Committee on Military and Intelligence Methodology for Emergent Neurophysiological and Cognitive Neuroscience Research. I really had to read this. This huge committee, or I don't know if it's huge, but has a big name, met in 2008, produced a report, and at that point they said, no, neuroscience and neurotechnology, very interesting stuff, but we're not ready for this stuff. There is no application in political, in military intelligence. 6 years later, 2014, same setting, same committee. Well, neuroscience and technology has matured a lot and is being considered, in some cases evaluated, so this seems to be official terms, right? For operational use, right? That's 2014. We're in 2023, so this is happening. I don't have the latest, but it's happening. But that's where the DARPA and IARPA are also at.
Let's give another hand to Dr. Suardi.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Suardi. Sure.
Let me give you this.
Yes. Grab that for you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you are interested in learning more about us, attending any future events, or making a gift to IWP, please feel welcome to visit us at iwp.edu. And before we close out, we would also like to announce our upcoming gala, which is affectionately entitled From IWP with Love, an Evening of Espionage. The event will be hosted on Thursday, October 26th at the International Spy Museum. Tickets are currently available at iwp.edu/events. Thank you again, and we hope to see you there.